Today we're going to talk about reader expectations. But first, this is a casual discussion, so let me go ahead and change my vibe. So what do I mean by reader expectations? I kind of have a question that I kind of want to pose everyone that's watching. And that question is should the expectations you have going into a book affect your enjoyment of the book or even affect your reading of the book? And there's 3 different categories I kind of want to touch on. One being when you go into a book with super high expectations. The other being when you go into a book with low expectations. And then the third one being when you go into a book expecting it to be a different genre than what it actually ends up being. You think it's going to be one way, but it's just completely different. It's not that necessarily it was high or low. It just didn't fit the synopsis that you were expecting. So I have some Goodreads reviews to try to show what I'm talking about. And then after we get through this discussion, please leave a comment down below telling me what you think about your own expectations going into reading a book. So I'm purposely choosing books that I've read recently as examples. And let's talk about when someone has high expectations going into a book and the book ultimately does not meet those expectations. Here I have a review on Goodreads from Sophia. I'd like to say that I totally would be friends with Sophia if I knew her because her bookshelves are hilarious. Look at how she shelved this book. The book is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer Armentrout. This is the book that she's reviewing. However, just look at her shelves here. A Man Saves a Day, Look at the Idiot, Failed Romance, How Was This Published, Your Typical YA Fantasy, Romance, I Am Disgusted, Mary Sue, Misplaced Hype, DNF. Those are some hilarious shelves. Like, to really have your Goodreads so organized that you have that much, I don't know, it's just, we would be friends, for sure. Anyway, she has a quick disclaimer that she didn't finish the book. Whatever, no, I don't care. But below, if you see the beginning of her actual rating, she says, today's guest is from Blood and Ash, or as I like to call it, from Mud and Trash. The hype deceived me once again. So usually when someone has high expectations of a book going in and then it falls short, it often gets dubbed as hype. This book was super hyped up and it didn't work for me. It does not deserve the praise it's getting. And nothing to do with her review whatsoever, but it kind of makes me wonder, when we have high expectations going into a book, but then a book falls short and doesn't end up being as good as we thought it would be, do we look at that book, rate the book, and view that book even lower than we did if we went into it blind, if we had no idea what the book was about? And I don't know. Like, if she just picked it up and she just assumed it was an author that no one's ever heard of and no one ever cared about the book, would she have believed it was a little bit better? And in her case, I have no idea. But in my case, reading books, I think that sometimes I overcompensate and thinking that this is even worse than it is, mainly because I expected so much. Let me know what you think about books that are overhyped and when your expectations are let down. Do you dislike that book even more than if you had just grabbed it from like a used bookstore for a book that like no one's heard about before? I'd be interested to see a response. This has an opposite, and that's when you go into a book assuming that it's just going to be okay or not that great. You have very low expectations going into it, and then the book ends up being good. It blows you out of the water. One book that I think a lot of people experienced this with was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn, Hugo. And I say that because I was going through my Goodreads, scrolling down, trying to go on to all the different books that I have on there that I've read recently, and I would do Control Find Expectations. And if you do Control Find Expectations on Evelyn Hugo, you actually get quite a few responses on every page. And those responses are almost all saying, low expectations going in, and it blew out of the water. Here's one of them. This is David Putnam. He's not quite as flamboyant as Sophia with his bookshelves, but that's okay. He says, wow, I did not expect to love this book as much as I did. Absolutely loved it. This is a story of powerful love between 2 women in a time when it was unacceptable. The author has a huge command of the language and seamlessly shifts from first person present tense to first person past tense and even to second person. Amazing. We don't need to read all the review, you get the idea. This is just one of the many reviews that are on this book and on other books too, where the expectations were low going in. You weren't sure if it was really your thing. You didn't know if the synopsis caught you or anything like that. You had low expectations, and then you get completely blown away. I also wonder if this affects how you view it when you go in with low expectations? Do you go into the book with such low expectations that almost anything could impress you? And The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is an amazing book. Not saying that. But when you go into a book with really low expectations, do you see like anything impressing you? Like, is it a lot easy to impress you? Then say like you have a really hyped up book, like the opposite they were talking about, and maybe the idea that everything all of a sudden doesn't impress you because you had such high expectations with low expectations. Does anything impress you? I don't know. But I think it definitely feels like you found a diamond in the rough, like you found a gem. And when you have a book that blows you away like that, when you didn't expect it to, that's a type of book where you're often going to go door to door trying to get people to read it. How do you feel when you find like a diamond in the rough, when there's a book that's amazing, but you were not expecting it to be amazing? And then there's expectations of genre. I recently on my channel had a big misconception of genre with the book The Lost Apothecary. I will go ahead and link it above, where I thought The Lost Apothecary was going to be a very dark, brutal book, and it ended up being a very light book and a really fast read. So for me, that was my most recent experience with the expectation of genre not matching up. But one other book that I've read recently that I've seen a lot of reviews talking about misconception of genre, I've already mentioned this before on my channel, is The Lesson by Cadwell Turnbull. Great book, but you don't expect what it is when you go into it. A lot of people don't anyway. For some people, when you have that misconception of genre, it hurts your ability to like the book. So I got a couple reviews here for The Lesson by Cadwell Turnbull. One is L, and then she says, well, this is another case of my expectations being far different than what the book ended up being. Maybe I can't really fault the author for that, but honestly, after reading the description, I just thought this is going to be something else entirely. So you can kind of tell from a review that she says she's not faulting the author, and she understands that it was just a misconception of genre. She thought it was going to be probably more of like a lighthearted space opera type science fiction, and it wasn't. But at the same time, you can tell that she didn't end up really liking the book for what it was. She left it at 3 stars, which meant she was like showing like, okay, this is a good book, but it's still not for me. That's what I read from it anyway. And then there's this other review for the same book who also has that same misconception of genre, but goes kind of the other way with it. And here is what she says. The Lesson is a literary tale on an alien invasion story set in the Virgin Islands. It largely centers Black characters, local culture, and touches on the history of slavery and colonization. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, but explores some interesting ideas. It uses the aliens as a metaphor for colonization, where they are both benevolent and brutally violent. And then she kind of goes on to correct that misconception of genre and kind of talking about how it's a lot more like literary science fiction or literary fiction. We don't need to read the whole review. But you can kind of see that she went into the book expecting probably the same thing, almost like a space opera type book or something like that, but ended up trying to enjoy it for what it was, for what she was actually given. And I think that's really hard to do. When you think that a book is going to be one genre, but it ends up being another genre, it's almost oftentimes a letdown to yourself so much to where you can't really appreciate the book for what it is to its full extent. I felt that a little bit with The Lesson, even though I ended up realizing, okay, yeah, this is a legitimately good book. But it took like a giant shift in me, which kind of almost put this negative tint on reading the book. Same thing with The Lost Apothecary that I just mentioned. And I think this gets back to the discussion I had a couple weeks ago on marketing. I'll link that above as well if you want to check out my discussion on marketing. I think it is so important when you do your synopsis and when you say what type of book it is, to really market it for the readers who are going to enjoy it. The Lesson was very much marketed as a science fiction, or at least that was what it gave off. And while it is a science fiction, it's way more a literary fiction, and it should have focused its marketing on getting it to literary fiction readers. The same thing with The Lost Apothecary. The Lost Apothecary was a historical fiction thriller type thing, I guess, but it kind of marketed it to for you to expect that it would be dark and heavy, but it ended up being light, almost like half the book felt like a light contemporary for the whole time. So that was not marketed for the group of readers who would love it the best. So I think that, honestly, authors and publishing companies almost kind of shoot themselves in the foot when they make people have these genre expectations and then it ends up being something different. I don't know, can you kind of think of a time where you were expecting a book to be a different genre, a different feel than what it actually was? And were you able to get over that? Were you able to jump over that hurdle in order to enjoy it anyway? The last thing I want to talk about that is on the topic of this discussion is, should we even try to really have expectations when we go into a book? And I think that most of us on BookTube, or that are constantly looking at Goodreads or Bookstagram or whatever it may be, we always have expectations going into books because we're constantly trying to talk to other people about books. It's an important hobby, I get that. But there's something for the reader that goes in blind, not knowing anything about a book and not having anything tainting their experience going into it. If you go in blind, anything can happen. You don't have high expectations, you don't have low expectations, you don't have genre expectations. And it's just the book has a completely fair chance, in my opinion, when you go in blind. But there's also some reason to prep, to actually look at what the book's about, because you can, if you have tropes you hate or if you have genres you love and you look into the book before you go into it, you're more likely to find the type of book that you really want than if you just kind of go in blind. So there's really, I don't know, there's two amazing approaches there. And I'm trying to mix them more in my reading. But I would really like to know, like, do you enjoy going into a book blind and just having it be whatever comes at you? Or do you prefer prepping, even though that has a downside of potentially leading you to some of these expectation problems? I'd love to hear what you think about either prepping or going in blind. If you have any other ideas of what to add to this discussion about expectations in books, please leave them down in the comments. It does not need to be related to something I mentioned here. I'm probably forgetting a bunch of things I want to say. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I hope to do more casual discussions in the future, and it's definitely more likely to happen if I see the same response I've been getting to the ones I've posted in the past. So give it a like and comment below. Hopefully you'll come back, and I'll see you later.